Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Goldster Live. I'm thrilled to be in conversation here with Dr. Emma Byrne, neuroscientist, and to be at Riverstone with a live audience as well as the lovely audience on Zoom. Emma has written 2 fabulous books so far. This is it, Swearing is Good for You. Going to find out why in a minute. The Amazing Science of Bad Language, and What Science Knows About Childhood, How to Build a Human. So, Emma, welcome to Goldster.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start off with, why is swearing good for you?
Oh, so many reasons. So when I started writing that book, it wasn't going to be called Swearing is Good for You. It was going to be That's effing amazing. How are people at Goldster with swearing, by the way?
Well, I think we need to be a little bit
I'll
careful.
be, because you never know who's on Zoom. Someone's grandkids walk through
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I promise to be as good as I can. But it's going to be That's effing amazing, because what had happened was I was in a neuroscience lab looking at essentially how brains evolve. And one of the main drivers for the evolution of the brain is the avoidance of pain. And so I was looking at all of these pain studies, and I found this fascinating one about pain and swearing by this guy called Richard Stevens from Keele University. And he'd managed to persuade hundreds of people to essentially stick their hands in freezing cold ice water and have them either say a neutral word or a swear word, and see if there was any difference in how long they could keep their hands in that ice water. And it turns out there is an effect that is stronger than a strong analgesic, stronger than taking, say, a cocodamol, in terms of keeping your hands in the ice water if you're swearing than if you're not. And I thought this was fascinating. And our lab was based in the Science Museum at the time. And I thought this is an absolutely brilliant experiment to do on members of the public when they come to the Science Museum late. Now, if you haven't been to a science museum late, it is basically just a singles market for all the Imperial College students. They come, there's a bar, they do geeky things, and then you see, these sort of 1,000 male students and the 4 female students all trying to mate with each other. But I was getting people to do this experiment thinking, oh, we could replicate this, because there's a dearth of replication in psychology studies. And unfortunately, I realized that if you do this at an event that has an open bar, there's also an extremely strong pain-killing effect of alcohol. So by the end of the evening, I was like, no, I'm just giving people frostbite. But that lit a fire under me for looking at how much research had been done into swearing. And the thing that I discovered that was most fascinating is that practically every swearing paper starts with, and of course, nobody is studying swearing because it's such a taboo topic. And this pile this high of papers that I had printed out on my desk showed that this is absolutely not the case. And I just became incredibly boring about swearing. Like, I would literally collar people on my way into the lab in the morning, go, found out something else about swearing. And somebody just went, could you just please tell anybody else about swearing? And I did a thing for Radio 4, which is called Forethought. They're these lovely 15-minute bite-size sort of things about random interesting things. The other person who was recording the night I did mine was all about the origins of plate glass and the fact that the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz, it basically invented window dressing.
Wow.
Dig that one out. It's a fascinating talk. In fact, if you can get her here, she's brilliant. But at the end of that, someone said, you should write a book on this. And I thought, really, me? But I was going to the Association of British Science Writers conferences at the time, and went to a sort of pitch meeting, and they went, oh, that's great, but you need a story, you need a through line. And I was like, well, I need to look at these things and see what they tell me about swearing. And it was only then that I noticed that every single one of them was demonstrating some benefit or other about swearing. This really surprised me, because I'd sort of not noticed this reading them. But some were looking at the swearing and pain killing, but there's also studies that show that swearing works really well for bonding and for encouraging teams. Swearing works really well for diverting violence. Swearing works really well at getting your message across, at showing what at least appears to be sincerity. And that swearing among primates, among chimpanzees who are taught to use sign language, pretty much demonstrates that swearing is probably one of the first kinds of language that we invented. And I think the chimpanzee studies were the ones that just went, that's it, I have to write about why swearing is essential in our language.
But what is it that certain words, I mean, they're just letters put together like every other word. Why is it that that particular combination has an effect? I mean, I was kind of looking at the book thinking, I still can't work out why having one change perhaps from in a letter from a completely innocuous word to a swear word, how does that have an effect on the brain? Why do we know that it's a swear word?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that I mention in the book is the fact that I thought that I was calling my brother a variation of the word twit and didn't realize that it was a very bad word until I got smacked around the back of the head. And it's like, I do love this whole thing. I got this in a YouTube comment when I was talking about swearing at I think it was a talk at Google, and someone on the YouTube comment had put, "This woman deserves a good smack." And I'm like, okay, so swearing is out, but violence.
Yeah, exactly.
But why that one letter makes a difference is partly because I got that smack to the back of the head. There was that emotional reaction. And what we learn about swearing very early on, in fact, we tend to learn it before late adolescence, is that swearing has this profound emotional effect because it's taboo. And that's one of the amazing things about the chimpanzee studies, is that the way that they invented swearing is that they were given words to refer to various things. They were very inventive users of sign language. So, for example, Washoe, she was the main chimpanzee, the matriarch of this colony, invented this phrase, drink fruit, for watermelon. She had a sign for drink and she had a sign for fruit. And it's really interesting that the same thing that we find salient about watermelon was what she found salient as well. There was something, hot drink was for a thermos flask. But one of the signs that they learned, and apologies if you have any young chimpanzees in the house who have been taught sign language, this one meant dirty. It's in all the literature, it's written as dirty, but it was to refer to defecation, basically. And she invented the sign dirty good, which was for her potty. Now, if you're training chimpanzees by keeping them around your home, this was essentially a cross-fostering experiment. They were living with these chimpanzees. You have to potty train them, because in the wild, chimpanzees will use their excrement to mark territory or settle fights. And what happened was, instead of throwing excrement, once this becomes a taboo, expressing anything to do with excrement becomes that way of expressing, that you're marking your territory or having a fight. And so these chimpanzees would argue with their human trainers or with the other chimpanzees by using this sign, dirty, or what we'd call the S word. And then they started using it humorously as well. Once they realized that there was an emotional reaction that they could get, particularly out of the humans, they would use this transgressively and for humor and in bonding. And these chimpanzees independently, this is not something that the humans demonstrated to them, invented their own swear words. And you might have noticed that even if you don't swear in front of your children or grandchildren, there are certain words that they'll pick up on as being a little bit rude, and then we'll use those with intense glee. And so it's that relationship between those sounds and a really emotive taboo that makes swearing. And you can even refer to the exact same thing. I've said excrement probably 3 or 4 times, and that's okay, but I haven't said the S word. And so it's not even just the fact that we're talking about this thing. There's a taboo about that particular
word. And why do you think that is? Why is it that swearing is so taboo?
Well, I think we need a set of words in every culture that allows us to express those emotional words. And it's interesting to see how that set of words changes between different countries that use ostensibly the same language. For example, if you look at Canadian French and French, the set of swear words is incredibly different because they've gone through this sort of divergent evolution. In Canadian French, you still have a lot of religious swear words, so things to do with the communion host, or the word tabernacle is incredibly rude. Again, apologies if anyone's dialing in from Canada, to the point that it's using French Canadian hip hop, which is a genre I didn't know existed until writing the book. Whereas in France, that makes no sense. They're using parts of the body or bodily functions the same way we do. There's also changes over time. So religious swearing was considered far more offensive earlier in the 20th century. Then it became bodily functions. Now we're moving to the point where things that are racist or ableist or sexist are considered more offensive. And what happens is, around the point of your adolescence, there are certain things in society that you learn have a particularly strong taboo. And so for me, it wasn't about bodily functions or sexual activity. There are swear words that I use quite casually, but there are other things to do with, people's sexuality or people's race that I wouldn't use. Whereas for my grandparents, that's completely flipped. That would be entirely flipped. There are certain words that were used in Agatha Christie book titles that now that the book is now called And Then There Were None, because the original title can't be used. So the fact that we can see swearing change gives us a clue as to what it is that makes swearing so powerful. And it's whatever those ideas are in society, they're a little bit dangerous, a little bit unsayable, a little bit risky. And those are the words that pack that strongest emotional punch.
And so if you were to use a word that was really taboo 100 years ago, but isn't now, it wouldn't have that pain-killing property because you wouldn't be associating it in that way. So what happens in the brain to cause that pain-killing effect by swearing?
One of the things that swearing is so unique in its activation in the brain is that it takes up far more of the brain than the rest of our language. You wouldn't think so. You'd think that this kind of speech now, where I'm having to think about every word and plan how this sentence is going to end, hopefully eventually, that would be far more, take up far more of my brain. And it requires more effort, but it uses very specific parts of the brain, which for most right-handed Westerners is found just about here. You have a couple of areas, Wernicke's and Broca's areas, that process speech and that allow you to produce speech. And when you think about speech, it's essentially a very detailed, coordinated set of muscle movements. It's the most intricate muscle movements that we make. So these areas send signals to the sort of various motor cortex parts of the brain that do the tongue, the throat, the diaphragm, the rib cage, and allow you to create these words. But with swearing, there's a whole other part of the brain that gets involved. Well, several. There's the amygdala, which is essentially kind of an emotional traffic light, lets you know whether or not something is likely to be emotive. There are other parts of sort of the emotional brain that are to do with plotting how, or trying to guess how other people might emotionally respond. So when you're swearing, you're using far more parts of the brain. And so there's possible that is more distracting than using any other form of speech. It's also possible there's something called the gate theory of pain, which is that if you put in a strong stimulus higher up the sort of neural tree than the pain you're experiencing, this is how TENS machines work. If you put a sort of an electronic pulse higher than wherever your pain is, your brain doesn't hear the pain from lower down because it's distracted. And this could be that the swearing is getting to a very high part of that neural tree in which we're experiencing the pain. It's working at the emotional part. And one of the reasons why we know that the brain has swearing in so many different parts of it, the ways in which swearing is so multiply redundant in the brain, is that we know how swearing is preserved in people who've had strokes. And this is some of the most fascinating research that I came across. So if you have a stroke on the left side of the brain, again, for most right-handed Westerners, there's a good chance that the language parts of the brain are going to be affected, but not for all of your language. The language that's involved in swearing, and also some other emotive phrases, quite often the phrases that your parents said to you in childhood, that tends to be preserved.
Gosh.
Because it's stored again in those emotional spaces. And that can be quite shocking to people who are living with someone who is rehabilitating after a stroke, who's lost their language. I was talking about this on a radio program, and one of the producers came up to me afterwards and said, I really need to tell my mum about this. My dad had a stroke about 6 months ago and hasn't been able to say her name or say that he loves her or any of those things. But we went out for a family picnic and a seagull swooped down and ate his sandwich, and he turned around and he just let rip with this sort of stream of invective against the seagull. And she was really hurt that, the first coherent language he produced was not her name or that he loves her. It's swearing at a seagull. And it's like, that's because swearing occupies so many parts of the brain.
That's so helpful, and helpful for people to know if they are with somebody who's had a stroke, or if they've had a stroke themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, so your swearing is likely to remain and to remain quite fluently. And some of the studies on that, particularly the one about what happened when they showed a stroke patient a picture of Ronald Reagan, it's exquisite.
So you mentioned also, as well as the swearing, the language of things that your parents might have said to you in childhood. So is that because at that early stage of childhood, your brain is developing in one area and later on your language develops elsewhere? How does that work?
Absolutely. So you're making very close connections between certain sounds, certain feelings, certain sensations, and certain emotional states, particularly when you're a very small child, and your understanding of what is safe, what is nice, what is pleasant, what's scary, what's aversive, that all comes in childhood. And so things that are connected with that feeling of being warm, safe, fed, dry, those are all the kinds of sounds of words, of phrases that tend to also occupy those quite emotional parts of the brain. So it's usual to hear, there's a lovely study from France that has a list of all of these different phrases, and they are things like, you know, it's okay, my darling, or sleep, baby. And these are things that stroke patients would say to themselves, essentially in a self-soothing kind of way, repeating the phrases that had come, you know, siblings saying, oh yeah, that's what our mum used to say. In fact, that's how our mum used to say it. The patterns are that closely wired to that emotional state.
Fascinating. Well, and so is this the same? The studies have been done on swearing all over the world. Are there any societies in which this doesn't happen?
No, and quite often there's this belief that it's sort of, oh yeah, but the Japanese don't swear. It's like, no, the Japanese are completely chill about things like poop, excrement. The reason we have a poop emoji is that emojis were developed in Japan, and there isn't that excrement taboo that we have. But things to do with essentially your intelligence or your attractiveness, these can be incredibly offensive. Or there are other countries where names of illnesses are used as swearing, or even just things like insulting somebody's mustache is considered deathly. So we don't necessarily recognize it as swearing in the same way that, for example, the thumbs up gesture or the okay gesture can be hugely offensive in other countries because they have different meanings. And we don't even realize we're doing something wrong. It's we don't recognize, if we hear words after adolescence, we're no longer quite so well attuned to picking up the emotional valence of that. So even if you become really skilled in a second or third language after adolescence, there is a chance that those swear words just won't ever properly register for you as swear words, which is why so many linguists have missed the sheer emotive power as they've gone out and studied those languages after adolescence.
And I find it fascinating when I'm hearing people speak in a foreign language, they usually swear in English. Do you know why?
I think partly because of American cultural hegemony.
Right.
So some of it is the fact that there are a lot of American films, and a lot of American films, particularly since the 90s, have a lot of swearing. And I put it down predominantly to that, and the fact that there's some great experiments that look at people's emotional state when they hear swearing in their second or third language. And you can tell from the fact that their heart rate doesn't go up as much, their palms don't get as sweaty, that those second or third languages don't have quite a strong and emotional valence. People will often choose to swear in what they call their stepmother tongue, their second language, because it's easier, because it doesn't have that emotional freight. So some of it, I think, is that there's this idea that you picked up these swear words that aren't the ones that your parents said, I never want to hear you say that. I'm going to wash your mouth out. You know, if they've told you that about the French swear words, but they never watched Pulp Fiction in the 90s, so you can use those swear words. But then I was reading Jerome K. Jerome's Diary of a Pilgrimage, and there is a line in there about how the fact that there's a French porter arguing with an Italian train guard on a German platform, and there's these three people and they're all arguing and they're all using English swear words. So it obviously goes back further than that.
A long way
and
then, yeah.
I'm not quite sure why it's our greatest cultural export, but there you go. It seems like a long way back. And maybe it's just that the British have been more relaxed about swearing loudly overseas. I've no idea.
So I was thinking that in a situation where you could kind of look at gauging pain and swearing, have you been tempted to just hang out in maternity hospitals?
I have, and for part of the reason was that when I first proposed this book, I was meeting with people in the publisher's office, and there was a woman who'd just come back from maternity leave, and she said, "You know, my midwife told me, stop swearing. You're just making it worse for yourself." And so I've wanted to get this in the hands of every trainee midwife, but actually, a lot of trainee midwives that I've spoken to have said, I would never say that. That sounds very, very old school.
Yes.
But there was this belief that swearing was catastrophizing. It would make you feel worse. And we now know that's not the case.
Yeah.
But incredibly off-brand. I didn't swear once during labour. And I figured out the way to have an almost pain-free labour is to have a really long, skinny baby. My baby's shoulders were really narrow and her head was long and thin. So yeah, it turns out that the relationship between swearing and labour, there's a third independent variable, and that's how
Big the
beefy your baby is. Mine was like, it was very long but very thin. So yeah, I didn't need to swear at all, and I feel.
Were you very disappointed about that? Were you wanting to swear and get the pain?
Do you know what, my
effects?
brain wasn't on that at the time.
Strange.
My brain was just, I'm done with this. It's been 72 hours. I'm very bored. She was long, she was thin, but she was very bloody slow. She was the wrong way round at the time. But I made up for it afterwards, and the first time I heard her swear, I heard it again in that exact same intonation that I use, and it's like.
And was she aware, your daughter, the first time that she swore, that it was a swear word, or was she just repeating it?
I think she understood. She didn't know the words swear word, but she knew what the word was for.
Yeah.
Because she was 2, and we'd gone on holiday to one of these all-inclusive, family-friendly resorts, which before I had kids would have been my idea of hell. Whereas now I'm like, yes, there's a buffet that sells predominantly pasta and ice cream, and they have high chairs, and there's a kiddie pool, and that's great. That's all I want, is that they will be entertained and happy, and I get to just sort of sit there on a sun lounger and go, okay, this is fine. So we'd gone to one of these places, and the problem is that this buffet is absolutely full of running around toddlers and slightly older children than that. My daughter's 2, just starting to toddle, just getting to be at the age where she can dump pasta predominantly on her own plate. So we'd gone and done that. And I said, look, the deal is, though, you stay in the high chair because you can't get up and run around. And you haven't used a high chair for a while, but you have to stay in this one. Can't get up and run around until you've finished, and then we'll go outside and we'll run around. And she kind of gets this. So she sat there and she's shoving the pasta in. She's 7 and we're still working on forks. I'm like, so she's shoving this pasta in her face, and she gets to the point where she's finished. I'm still ongoing with my spaghetti carbonara or whatever. And I suddenly hear this voice pipe up going, Mummy, get me out of this high chair. And there was this moment where I just went, I like this. Because 6 months ago, that would have been the back arching, full screaming, plate throwing tantrum. And she just went, Mummy, get me out of this effing high chair. And I went, you're bored now, aren't you? All right, fine. Let me finish and we'll go out and we'll have a run around like I promised. And there's like, people had said to me when I was writing it, and I was hugely pregnant while I was walking around New York, selling it to like the New York publishers. Like, what do you do the first time your kid swears? And I was like, I have no idea. Turns out that I went, yep, that was a very strong signal, and I entirely understand what you mean. So we talk a lot about where it is and is not appropriate and what it does and doesn't mean. But I recognize that she has this tool in her armory for communicating with me.
And it prevented the tantrum. That's what I find really fascinating.
Absolutely prevented.
She vented rather than having the physical display.
Yeah, and she got my attention in a way that a tantrum would have got my attention, but it would have been much harder for either of us to deal with. But yeah, I knew she was serious. And so yeah, I didn't immediately go to the swearing. I went to the, oh yeah, I promised you, didn't I? And I'm sitting here chatting, and you're like, you promised me I didn't have to stay here forever. So yeah, and there've been a couple of mistakes, but the one mistake actually was when I didn't point out that what I'd said was quite an emotional word, because to me it wasn't. I'd referred to her bike, her not being able to ride her bike to school because it had got quite rusty over winter, and I said, oh, your bike is now a bit the milder C word, the poop C word. And she'd gone to school, and the head teacher shakes her by the hand on the way into school. Dad took her in, and the head teacher went, oh, is actually not on your bike today? And she went, no, Mummy says it's
I think you're allowed to say that word.
Crap. Mummy says it's crap. Not allowed to say that at school. So yeah, so that was the only one that, because I said that without any real emotion behind it, she didn't notice. But all the really emotional words she knows. Same as, you know, she wouldn't stamp her feet in school. She's, yeah, kids
It's
are great at code
fascinating, the
switching.
power of language and the very fact that, you know, we do, it's been back forever, that it's been really powerful. And I find the chimpanzee study really, really interesting.
I mean, if we made a law, and I think it was Mussolini tried to make a law that said swearing is banned, no one must ever swear. Okay, we'd invent it. Even if we had this sort of somehow collective amnesia that we forgot all of the swear words, we would reinvent it. The next generation would reinvent it with something new.
So there's a lot of people I know who, when they have children, they come up with useful words that are completely harmless. One of my friends used to say bucket a lot. And and does that still, if you're using that word to kind of, you know, to prevent your children hearing swear words, does that still have the same power when it comes to things like pain relief, or you just
no, sadly not.
Okay.
There's a name for them. It's called minced oaths, and Richard Stevens, who did that original ice bucket challenge, tried this, or one of his students actually proposed this experiment. And yeah, the minced oaths don't,
right,
because we know they're not. And if they did have that same emotional impact, I would argue that they would end up being swear words. Yeah.
So let's move on to this book. So I'm assuming that How to Build a Human, What Science Knows About Childhood. This presumably was inspired by becoming a mum yourself. Am I right in that?
Absolutely right. Yeah, the sort of journey to parenthood. I realized, and I think I say this at the beginning of the book, that I suddenly realized that I felt lost, afraid, confused, convinced I was getting it wrong. No one could give me any good answers. I felt terrified and bored at the same time. And the thing it reminded me of was doing my doctoral research, that feeling of, oh God, I don't know what I'm doing and no one can tell me and I have to figure it out. And the stakes feel terribly high if I get it wrong. And to be honest, they felt high with my doctorate. They felt a lot higher with my daughter. And that realization that what I do when I don't know what to do is go and read. I mean, it's literally since childhood, like when in doubt, go to the library. And looking at child development studies and what is going on literally in their brains as they're developing was absolutely fascinating. Recognizing that babies aren't immature adults, they are almost an entire, from the point of view of brain structure, it's almost entirely different. There are a few areas, particularly things around the limbic system and stuff that's emotional, that doesn't undergo much changing. But in terms of not just the structures that are there, but the way in which those structures are used, they change so dramatically from infancy through adolescence. And then again, when you become a parent, you go through another massive rewiring. Or if you become a carer in older life for someone who, you know, for reasons of having had a stroke or Alzheimer's, you have to become a carer again. You are flooded with prolactin. Which one is it? I think it's called prolactin, the hormone that essentially is the one that, it's called that because it instigates breastfeeding. But the other thing that it instigates in both men and women who become carers at any age is the growth of new neurons. And it's the first time in your life since infancy that your brain radically puts on new connections. So there's something about birth, development, becoming a carer that creates an awful lot of new connections, and then the rest of the time is spent pruning those connections in order to figure out what's important, and looking at how that pruning is done and that rewiring through life really helped me navigate what was going on with my daughter when it seemed like she was being, you know, defiant, forgetful, frustrated, realizing that actually she's not even sensing the world the same way I am. Realizing that a lot of the baby manuals are horrifying in that they assume a certain standard average baby that doesn't exist.
Right.
So yeah, realizing the variance, that all of these studies showed me quite how much variety there is in children, both between children and then in a one child, from literally in infancy from day to day, and then throughout their life from week to week, month to month, year to year, really helped me relax a bit more about the fact that every time I thought I got it nailed, it would change again.
So I remember my mum and a group of her friends talking when they'd first become grandparents and saying how amazing it was, how, you know, how much better it was than being a parent, even that the love they had for their grandchildren. And of course you can just have fun and then hand them back. This is what you were saying about literally starting to grow new neurons in your brain because you've got this little person who's come into your life. So it's an actual physical thing that changes your brain when you become a grandparent.
It does. If you're spending time with small babies, and actually, quite literally, the smell of babies' heads will boost these levels of this particular hormone, prolactin, and yeah, smelling babies' heads is great.
Which is why you see kind of people doing that. It's a fascinating thing. That's actually just something that's really primitive that we are wired to do because we're getting hormones.
Yeah, and there is like a slight dopamine hit with that as well. So one of the things that you need in order to learn is sensitivity to reward. The role of dopamine, interestingly, comes up in the book on swearing, in the thing about Tourette's syndrome. People who have Tourette's syndrome are overly sensitive to dopamine, but we become quite sensitive to dopamine when parenting or caring, becoming a grandparent, because you need to notice what works, to notice that you were mentioning earlier about your Fitbit and not getting that little dopamine hit of going, well done, you did 10,000 steps, but there is no well done like a baby falling asleep contentedly in your arms because you did the right thing. Your brain at that point goes, yes, keep doing that. And then you need, actually testosterone goes up in new mothers because you need that to make you leap out of bed when your baby is crying in the middle of the night. So this whole idea of there are certain hormones that the mum gets and there's certain hormones that the dad gets, actually not true. Both parents and grandparents, basically anyone who gets someone, particularly a baby, but is told you are now responsible for the well-being of this being, is now dependent on you, you will start to experience these hormonal surges, some of which, like the dopamine hits, will be very pleasurable, some of which will be incredibly anxiety inducing.
Yeah, fascinating. So when you were writing this, how old was your daughter?
She was about a year old when I started, and it came out, I think the swearing incident had happened, so she's probably about 2 when I finished it. And now she's old enough to come to talks and see me talk about her swearing when she was 2. And at some point, she's going to figure out that she should be in for some share of the royalties.
So did you find that you were doing a scientific experiment, that having given birth and helping your child to develop was all grist to the mill for writing the book?
The thing that felt most like a scientific experiment was the fact that, so when you're a kid and you learn science in school, you're told, you put the magnesium in the Bunsen burner and you get a bright flame. And you think that's what science is. You do A and then B, and you get result C, and it's perfectly reproducible. When actually science, as it's done as a researcher, is you try A, B, and C, and they don't quite work, but you realize that actually what you needed to do was D. So you do that, and then you realize that actually no, what you need, and this constant refining of the question and this constant learning through failing is, I think, the part of my scientific training that most prepared me for parenthood, was realizing that if it doesn't work, try something else. Don't keep doubling down. Even if the literature says this is what you should do, you've found a new phenomenon. And I think the one thing that I really want people to take away from that book is that, and anyone who's had more than one child knows this, is that parenting books are a lie. That they say, this is what you do to make your baby happy. And anyone who's had 2 babies, one of whom slept through the night instantly but wouldn't feed, and the next one is a champion feeder but is awake every 5 minutes, knows that there is no one answer. But I had to learn that the hard way. And so that reassurance that you're going to take a few goes, there's going to be a lot of trial and error. So it felt more like a scientific experiment from that point of view. And I guess also that from the point of view of curiosity being the main motivating force. Again, I think that's why grandparenting is so nice. And for me, being an auntie, I've always loved being an auntie, is you can just be so curious about this child.
Best job being an aunt. You get to hand them back as well.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic.
It's that sense of, who are you? What are you becoming? Rather than, I think, particularly with a lot of judgment and shaming, particularly of mothers, there's this idea that your child has to be something in order to reflect well on you, otherwise you've messed up. Whereas those stakes, I don't think, obtain with when you're being an aunt or being a grandparent. And so also taking off that pressure of going, if my child says a swear word at a holiday resort, someone's going to be judging me. It's like, that's fine. They can judge me all they like. Right now, my daughter's not having a tantrum.
Yes, exactly. And you're seeing that as a real positive, that she's not having that tantrum.
Yeah.
So when children are growing up, what should people know? Parents, grandparents, carers, what should they know about what's happening to their brains? And that presumably there are some things that no matter what you do, no matter how brilliantly you try to parent or care, you're not going to get right. What would reassure people?
Yeah. So definitely the fact that your child's brain, particularly in the pre-tween years, is literally rewiring itself every few weeks initially, and then months up to about the age of 10. That even before puberty, the number of changes in the brain, in terms of the way that neurotransmitters are used, in terms of the structures that are used, it's changing very rapidly. There are going to be times when your child seems to completely ignore everything you're telling them. Something that they absolutely understood 6 weeks ago has somehow vanished from their brains. That's true, it has, and it's not your child's fault. There's a reason why hardly any of us can remember anything that happens before the age of 2, and that's because we literally lost most of the structures that we had up until that point. Their sense of identity is changing constantly as well. So when they're first born, they see themselves as well, they don't even necessarily understand that they have a separate existence from you. And there's a really lovely video that I share sometimes in live events, but I haven't put it online because it is sort of somewhat private, but of my daughter going from that moment where she moves from mirroring to mimicking. So this is for people who are still parents or grandparents of kids around the sort of 6 months to 18 months stage. Up until that point, they'll do an awful lot of mirroring. Whatever you do, they will copy directly. So you touch their face, they'll touch their face. I remember cleaning my teeth with my daughter on my lap and watching her pull these really weird faces and going, why are you going like, and it's like, oh, she's copying what I'm doing as I clean my teeth. That's the mirroring stage. And then at some point, you barely notice this. And somehow I caught this on video, the moment where it happened for me, because I hadn't read the research on this at the point. It was only looking back and going, oh, I know what happened there, is they start to mimic. And that means they've developed something called a theory of mind. They've started to know what it is you are intending. And so I've got this video where my daughter and I are sort of lying side by side, and she's quite snotty. So I get this tissue and I go, wipe, 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 and I wipe my own face. And then I hand the tissue to her and I go, wipe, wipe, expecting her to mimic me, to mirror me rather. Do the exact same thing to herself that I've just done. And instead she starts flailing this tissue around. I'm like, oh, of course not. Of course you're not going to do that. And she gets it into her other hand so she can roll over and wipe my face. And what I hadn't realized at the time is that is when my daughter finally realizes she's a person and so am I. And that comes off and on around sort of 12 to 18 months. This child suddenly realizes they're a person. And that's quite often the moment that we start to refer to as the beginning of the terrible twos. And it's not terrible. It's just they're finally experimenting with the fact that they're not you, and they can say no to you, and they can do things that are different to what you want them to do. And it's going to take them a while to experiment with that. And there are lots of different ways of dealing with that. One great one, best one that I was ever taught by someone who sort of found what works for them and also happened to work for us, is give them a choice, no matter how fake that choice is. It's like, we're going out, do you want to wear the pink gloves or the white gloves? you know, we have to leave the park in 5 minutes. Do you want your last go on the slide to be on the slide or on the swing? And it's like they don't get the choice over whether or not they're leaving, but they're given a choice. So that's really useful. That'll go on until about the time that they're tweens. And then they get this thing where they're trying to pull away. And it's not just that they've realized that they're a separate person from you, they want to be a different person from you. And again, this is really important because we are what's called an altricial species. There's two kinds of species, or a spectrum from precocial, animals that are born essentially ready to do everything they need to do. So like when a foal is born, it can instantly walk. Crabs will lay an egg and leave it. Certain species of crab lay an egg and leave it, knowing that their offspring will, if you know, emerge completely capable of taking care of themselves. Our babies are not able to take care of themselves for about 10% of their lives, which is terrifying, really. And even that's, you know, generous. If you imagine like 10% of our lives is what, 9 years, 9 years. I mean, we've got a 9-year-old at home. She's not ready to look after herself. So maybe 15-20% of our lives. And they're going to grow up in a culture that's different from the one we grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
So there comes a point when they're going to start looking for information about how they should be from people who are much closer to their own age. And that's quite often terrifying. I'm dreading it. But it's a really important part of how humanity has managed to evolve. Because we space our generations out so much, there has to come a point where your kids are learning to navigate the world they're growing up in, not the world you grew up in. And it's going to scare the crap out of you. But it is the thing that's going to allow them to succeed. And I feel my hand shaking thinking about it. There was no social media when I was a teenager. I'm so scared.
I don't know how anybody navigates that minefield.
Yeah. So when that happens, it's not personal. It's not that they hate you. It's that the world that they're growing up in is not the world that you grew up in. And the only thing that's going to make it any easier for you is trying to understand their world rather than trying to get them to navigate the world that you remember. So I hate that.
As a neuroscientist,
yeah,
you presumably know a lot about what happens to the adolescent brain. Does that help at all?
One thing that three things that help. First of all, them needing to sleep until really late and staying up really late is universal. It goes back throughout history. It's not because they're on their phones all night. It's because, for some reason, teenagers and people who are reaching the third age tend to have real difficulties getting to sleep early, staying asleep the whole night. Now, for most of human history, we haven't stayed asleep the whole night. This is an invention to do with the Industrial Revolution and going, no, we want you to come in and work for a certain set number of hours. So therefore, you have to fit your sleeping into 8 hours, your life into 8 hours, and your work into 8 hours. Well, now, more likely, you'll sleep into 6 hours, your life into 4 hours, and your work into 14 hours. And teenagers cannot overcome this need to sleep in a way that benefits society. So when they're lying in late and going to bed late, they are literally sleeping in a way that used to benefit society, because adolescents are these able-bodied, fairly responsible, honestly, members of your society, of your tribe, who are not yet caring for offspring. And so if something goes wrong in the night, something attacks in the small hours, they are the people, together with your elders, who are the ones who are not actively raising the next generation, who you can kind of spare to fight off the tigers.
That's fascinating.
So the poor sods, it's not their fault. They're wandering around at like 2 a.m. going, oh no, and then you kick them awake at like 9:30 the next. I mean, the best thing we could do for adolescents is move secondary education an hour later.
See, I've heard a lot about this. There's been a lot in the news recently. It just doesn't fit in with parents.
Industrial,
but actually, so you think that would be a really good thing to start school later and finish it
absolutely
later?
Yeah. And because school is doing two things, it's trying to fit these kids for a society in which they can be, let's face it, predominantly economically productive, but also hopefully happy and well adjusted. and also provide childcare so their parents can be economically productive, the timing just isn't right for kids at all, particularly adolescent kids. And then the other thing is, when you look at adolescents in brain scanners and give them things like sort of driving simulators to do and tell them that their parents are watching versus their friends watching, not only do they drive more safely when they think their parents are watching, they get a bigger dopamine hit from thinking that their parents are approving of what they're doing.
Interesting.
They will not tell you this, because see everything about, they need to make sure that they're fit for the society they live in, not the society you think they live in. But they still care what you think. They still absolutely care what their parents, their grandparents, the trusted older people in their lives, they care what you think, and what you say really matters. And also adolescents are basically trying to work out who they are. The other amazing fMRI scan was looking at how people talk about themselves biographically. So you put an adult in an fMRI scanner and you ask them questions about a literary character that they might know quite well. So for example, the example that's used quite often is Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter books. And it's like, what do you know about Hermione Granger? You know, it's like, is she the kind of person that would rather go to the library or a loud party? And you go, library, obviously. Is she the kind of person that has lots of friends or has a few very close friends? A few close friends, obviously. Is she kind of the person that, you know, is like really stylish and fashionable, or is she a bit nerdy? And then they go, okay, so how about you? Are you the kind of person that prefers the library or to go out to a loud party? And it's like, that's the point at which I realize I'm basically Hermione Granger, because the answers are all the same. But the thing is, I'll also be using the same part of my brain, the part that has remembered these facts about both this fictional character, Hermione Granger, and also the things that I would remember about you as a friend. I'm also remembering the stories I've told myself about myself. Whereas adolescents, when you say, you know, tell me about Hermione, now tell me about you, they use a very different part of the brain.
Wow.
When you say, tell me about you. And it's the part of the brain that's used for figuring out things, for solving problems. And they're trying to weigh up the evidence of what they know about themselves to work out what kind of person they are. Now, the thing is, we can choose at any age to reactivate that part of the brain that goes, I don't know if I'm the kind of person that prefers libraries to loud parties, because I haven't been to a loud party for 30 years because I've been telling myself I'm Hermione Granger. And so allowing yourself to experiment with new things, to try something new and go, do you know what, I'm agnostic about what I'm really like, and being more like an adolescent can be a really healthy thing. But your adolescents don't have a choice. They are agnostic about who they are. And whatever you say to them at this age, they may seem like they don't care, but it has a profound impact on who they will believe they are. And so even just things like saying to your teenager, God, you're so messy. God, you're so clumsy. You're so untidy. Focus. It's one of those real sort of positive parenting mantras, but focusing on, hey, have you noticed that when you don't tidy up your bedroom, you can't find your stuff and you're late for school, i.e. this is the behavior and these are the consequences, not you are an untidy person. Because if you say you are an untidy person, you guarantee that becomes part of their story.
Yes.
And they will remain an untidy person forever. So
I was told at school when I was 12 that I was never going to be any good at languages by my French teacher.
Yeah.
In my first year of trying to learn a foreign language.
Yeah.
And then when I was 18 and I was living in Austria, I went to evening classes and got told I was a natural linguist. And I'd spent 6 years believing I couldn't learn languages.
It's
because
heartbreaking.
The teacher had decided that I couldn't. And so I didn't.
Yeah.
Until I learned it in a different setting with a teacher who was good.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating how those things define people. And I find a lot of children, particularly teenagers, are labeled by everything at the moment. They're labeled by social media, by their peers, by their schools, and they have no concept yet of who they really are.
Yeah.
So one thing I was fascinated by was the age at which the brain stops growing. Can you talk to us about that?
Adolescence goes on a lot longer than we realize and we give it credit for. And there's this idea that somehow this generation is having some kind of prolonged adolescence because we're babyfying them. Actually, throughout history, our brains have remained very malleable up to and including the sort of early to mid 20s. Now, this is possibly to do with the fact that our generational gaps were smaller before, that people would start having children in their late teens and early 20s. And so remaining malleable literally until the point where you have to learn how to be a parent is very, very useful. Now, thankfully, it turns out that you can become malleable again, even when you become a parent or a grandparent. I mean, I became a parent at an age that in previous generations, people would have become grandparents because it took so bloody long. So knowing that that flexibility can be regained is very useful. But yeah, we tend to remain at our most flexible, which is essentially the definition of adolescence, is this idea of things changing until about that sort of early to mid 20s stage. But like I said, shifting out of that pattern of telling yourself the same story about yourself and being more adolescent, taking a few risks, hanging out with some people who might be a bit of an influence on you, can be a fantastic way of changing the narrative. I mean, the fact that you had someone at 18 who went, "You're a natural at this," allowed you to rewrite that story. For me, it was, I did a piece of art I must have been sort of 13, 14. I had to draw a perspective drawing of a tap with highlights and reflections. And it was bad. It was genuinely bad, but I had labored over it and I rubbed bits out and done it back in again. And the art teacher, instead of saying, "Look, I can see what you're struggling with here," just wrote on it, "This is not a serious attempt." Now, the thing was, it was crap, but it was a very serious attempt.
I was going to say,
but I could not, literally. I'd gone to things like where they'd gone, so, just sort of like draw, just stick figures. It doesn't matter, just stick figures, but draw what you'd like to. And I would freeze, like ice down my spine. And I knew that when my daughters were born, my daughter and our housemate's daughter, I did not want to scare them with this. I didn't want to pass on this idea that art is scary. So I bought this book of like how to draw step by step. I now have a couple of watercolor paintings hanging up in the house that I'm actually proud of, but it took, more than half of my life so far to get to the point where, with YouTube videos and some cheap watercolors from like Cass Arts, and going, it doesn't matter if the first few are crap, that finally retell that story. But it's still very hard to not go, I'm the person who is so bad at art that it's not a serious attempt.
We have a comment here. It says, "Really useful tips about adolescence. We'll try it out on my problematic nephew. Thanks." And somebody's already liked that. So I think somebody else is feeling the same. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, and problematic. I mean, it's one of those things that whatever those problems are, it's problematic for you, and it's probably a problem for that person too. And recognizing that, when you're having a relationship that's become problematic, just being willing to say, I'm going to try something different. It's amazing what a difference that can make. So good luck, and wish you all the best.
So for thinking about brains beyond building humans in adolescence and mid-20s, as we're getting older, what do we need to know about keeping our brains active? And what do we need to know about what's happening in our brains?
So brains, like any other part of the body, do start to find it a little harder to repair themselves, do find it a little harder to be quite so flexible as when we're younger, and sort of getting to that point of going, I'm not in my 30s, I'm not, almost not in my 40s anymore, and it makes a difference. So recognizing that there are certain things that might take a little longer, that might take a bit longer to remember things, or that you might need to write a few more things down, and not to see that as the fact that in the same way that I ran a marathon in my 20s, my knees right now would murder me if I tried to run a marathon. But it doesn't mean that I can't do anything. I've taken up a martial art that's sort of better for stiff joints. And so it's about adapting to the brain that you have now. And it is perfectly good at, doing some things. You're here now listening to a talk that, hopefully has been a bit interesting and has made you make some new connections about your life. And, someone saying, I'm hopefully going to use this with my nephew. You're learning things. you are still learning things. And the best thing you can do for your brain is find new things that you can learn. Now, it might not be sitting down and learning a new language. It might not be, learning, I don't know, crochet or something. You might be like, oh God, I already do that. I mean, we're quite often told things like, oh, do Sudokus, do crosswords. And that's great because they're kind of puzzly. But there's nothing like learning for generating those connections, making sure that connections stay active and finding new interests. Again, it's this thing about being willing to change the story. So something that you wouldn't normally be drawn to, even if it's, walking in from Barnes, from wherever you're walking to, going, I wonder what happens if I try a different route today. Thinking, I wonder what happens if I order something different on the menu. And allowing yourself to experiment and have a new experience. There's nothing like novelty for making your brain, do a nice bit of a gentle stretch.
So it's basically keeping your brain working out.
Yeah, and trying not to get too stuck in a rut. And again, when you're tired or when you've got a lot going on or when you're stressed, there is something so reassuring about the familiar and about the routine. There's the comfort food, the comfort routine, the comfort places. So trying something new every so often and going, I can do this. I'm not run out of new things to try yet. Staying curious about the world is probably the thing that is going to help you enjoy your brain and enjoy the experiences that your brain allows you to have as long and as fruitfully as possible.
I think it's fascinating. I can't believe we're nearly at the end of time. I've just checked the time. I could talk to you about this for hours. It's so interesting. And do you feel that as a neuroscientist, you will ever know a brain?
Oh God, no. It's one of the things that I love, and one of the things that I will like literally fight Elon Musk about. I'm putting that out there now, Elon, if you're listening. I will fight you. Forget Zuckerberg. I will cage match you over whether or not we can ever make computers think. I started out in AI. My background originally was in AI. That was what my doctorate was in. And I realized that human brains, I realized that bee brains are more interesting than computers. I started out in a lab that was looking at how bees perceive color, like literally bees, teaching bees to play noughts and crosses. And we are, as I said, we're shaped by the desire to find things that are pleasurable, avoid things that are painful, and pass on our genes. Computers do none of those things. So even when something can reproduce long screeds of text that look an awful lot like other screeds of text that have been scraped off of the internet, that machine has no understanding of the feelings, the knowledge, the sort of tacit understanding of the world that went into writing those words in the first place. This is why we know each other from writing. Novelists, do not be afraid that AI is coming for your job, because the ability to strike that balance between the familiar and the strange, to recognize that experience, that sensation of something that is, that speaks to somebody on a level that is about their emotional, their sensory, their, sort of cultural existence, is something that only comes through the long chain of evolution that takes us way back through our primate ancestors and even our mammalian and reptilian ancestors, that had to avoid the scary thing and go after the desirable thing. I'm working on a new project. I'm going to mention it. I'm not going to say who it's with or exactly what it is, but one of the research that I want, some of the research I've done at the moment, is the way in which we forget how scary certain things were. And we lie to ourselves about the risks of things, and we lie to ourselves about how pleasurable things were, in what seems to be an attempt to keep ourselves motivated to, keep trying to hunt down that gazelle, keep avoiding the really big scary snake. And that still is what drives us. We've created these societies in which we meet, orders of magnitude more people than we would ever done in our evolutionary past. We've created these societies in which we get scary emails from the boss, but we never see a tiger. We've created these societies in which we can, go and find a donut in Sainsbury's, but, it's really hard to go and pick a bit of fresh fruit. But we've still got that same neural architecture that was driving us all along.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. So Dr. Emma Byrne, and if you want to see her books, they are Swearing is Good for You, The Amazing Science of Bad Language, and How to Build a Human, What Science Knows About Childhood. There's so much more I could talk to you about, but I can't because we've run out of time. Just to say that I'm back with the book club later this week. I've got Sarah Baxhorton talking about Jack the Ripper. She discovered that she was descended from one of the men, the Metropolitan detectives who worked the Jack the Ripper case, and she has come up with a solution. It's absolutely fascinating. And then on Friday, I'm talking to Miranda Moore about good morning rituals, about why it's really important every morning to start discovering your own rituals. So really fascinating week for me, and I hope for everyone else on Goldster. And I would just like to say, for those of us who can see us, not those on the podcast, that Emma and I managed to turn up wearing almost exactly the same jacket today. So I feel that we should be on commission from the company. It's hilarious. This wasn't planned. It's not a uniform, but we obviously have similar taste.
If anyone's looking for them, the Kew Gardens gift shop is the ideal place to go shopping for clothes.
So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today. And Emma, it's an absolute joy to have you here. And when the next book, which you can't talk about yet because the contract's not done, when it's done, I really hope you'll come back on and talk to us about more things on Goldster.
I would love to.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.